the 700s BC, or thereabouts, the various Greek city-states, or poleis, began to look more aggressively outward in the search for resources, in the search for territory, and even prestige. And this they were following in the footsteps of the Phoenicians, who, in the 3 or 4 centuries previous, dominated that maritime international trade. The Greeks, too, had colonized before, so-called First Greek colonization between the 11th and 8th centuries or so BC, moving into the Aegean more and a little beyond. But that was different. This second Greek colonization, starting around the 700s, was more purposeful, it was more organized, and it was often carried out at the direct instigation of the established poleis. In any case, it probably began with a small group of traders, merchants, guys looking to increase their access to various goods and resources. And so they'd venture out to sea. The Greeks, of course, great seafarers, as their mythology attests, as their epic poetry attests, and as what's left of their wares, scattered as they are all over the Mediterranean and far beyond, also attest. So these guys would set out and set up small trade depots here and there, maintaining their distribution network, of course, at home, so that critical link between their trade depot and the home city was maintained. Greek colonists by the thousands set out to join these trade centers, and they became towns and they became cities. Often these colonies, which of course still are tied to a home city back in Greece, outgrew the home city. Syracuse, for example, a colony, at one point was the largest Greek polis on earth, far outgrowing the home city. Well, at first, it was the islands around Greece itself, and then islands and coastline further afield, particularly in southern Italy and Sicily. This has become the most Hellenized of, the Greek colonial world, with major implications for future Western civilization. And then, within, a few generations, you've got Greek colonies all over the Mediterranean world, including along the North African coast. A few generations after that, and you have Greek colonies far beyond the confines of the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, I'm standing here on the far eastern coast of the Black Sea. Okay, so this is 1,000 miles from Greece, 1,000 miles east of Greece as the crow flies. And the Greeks had colonies here. In fact, this is the Georgian city of Batumi. But in the 500s BC, this was the Greek colony of Batus, the 500s BC far eastern coast of the Black Sea. In fact, the Greeks had colonies literally ringing the Black Sea. One of the great examples of the colony that outgrows the home city was Miletus, said to have something like 100 colonies, daughter colonies of its own, many of them located around that Black Sea coast. And in order to survive here, these were not the highly Hellenized colonies of southern Italy or of the Aegean or elsewhere in the Mediterranean. It took a delicate mix of diplomacy and warfare to hang on in many of these Black Sea coastal areas. 3,000 years ago, this territory would have been located within the kingdom of Caucasus. And the Greeks incorporated this wider world into their culture, into their very mythology. So, for example, it was near here, according to that mythology, that the mighty Zeus chained down the Titan Prometheus for his eternal punishment, to suffer his eternal punishment. And it was here, in Caucasus, that King Aedes ruled. Aedes, whose sorceress daughter was Medea. This was home to the Golden Fleece, what Jason and the Argonauts sought. Okay, so all this wider world was incorporated into Greek culture. And the Greeks could do that. The reason that wider world existed in the Greek mind was because of Greek trade. It was because of these poleis, this colonization that had taken place. At its high point, there was something like 1,000 poleis, 1,000 Greek city-states, stretching from Spain in the west all the way to the eastern Black Sea, to the Caucasus here in the east. Now, it's true that every now and then there's a colony set up purposefully for non-trade purposes, for military purposes, maybe to guard a certain trade network or something. But for the most part, this really was about trade. This is about building wealth. This is about exchange. The Greeks are offering marble goods. They're offering their very famous pottery, of course, wine, olives, oil, and a bunch of other things. And there seeking access to, I mean, you name it, whatever was native to the colony in question. It might be timber, it might be food items. It often was food items. In fact, here in Caucasus, they're looking for grain. They're looking to get hold of fish, salted fish. But elsewhere, it might be ivory or slaves, lots of slaves, gold. And by the way, the Greeks did have competitors. I mean, the Phoenicians, they're still active. They've still got their vast trading networks. The Etruscans are active. There's other groups. There's local traders. So the Greeks aren't alone in all this. But at this point in time, the Greeks do dominate maritime trade. Now, by the time the bulk of the Greek colonies had been established, you're probably talking about 50, 60, 70,000 people, Greeks, have left Greece to go join these colonies. And something like 40-50% of all Greeks in the world are actually from the colonies. They're not from Greece itself. Okay, so this represents, at least relative to the total population of Greece, the Greek population, you know, a massive diaspora. And often that Greek culture, you know, spread wherever the colonies were. It spread, it put down deep roots, and often it didn't. Here in Caucasus, for example, those roots did not go deep for a very long time. Greek culture, talking Greek language and Greek ideas and Greek science, Greek architecture and Greek institutions, you know, the gymnasium, the theater, Greek food, all that stuff probably didn't extend in terms of real influence beyond the local elites of Caucasus. However, centuries later, what had been established here in the 500s BC would have a profound influence. Greek culture would have a profound influence here in Georgia later on. And whether or not the Greeks were able to culturally influence far and wide wherever they, you know, established their colonies, that trade network alone represents a major cultural, you know, implantation. So here, whether or not that cultural influence extended beyond the elites, for centuries, that trade network, you know, directly linked Europe with the Caucasus, directly linked Europe and beyond with the Caucasus and beyond. This far-flung Greek world, spread out as it was from southern France and Spain on one side all the way to the Caucasus to here on the other side, this was all a Greek civilization. It shared in that common Greek culture. And that connectedness manifested itself in a variety of ways. Whether it's, you know, banding together in the face of a common threat, for example, that of the Persians, or, you know, whether it's building monuments at Delphi or sending athletes to Olympia, or building academies of learning and scholarship that transmitted Greek knowledge, Greek wisdom, or whatever, facilitating the movement of Greek people from one outpost of Greek culture to the next. People of whatever polis. This was a common culture. This was their Greek world. By the time you get to the era of Philip II of Macedon, his more notable son Alexander the Great, of course, a whole era of Hellenization breaks open. A lot of that Greek influence becomes even more deep-rooted than it was before. Still, this was not a one-way street. This was a two-way street. Everywhere the Greeks set up colonies, the locals made their influence, often very strongly. So, for example, here, these colonies, what emerged by the time you get to around the 200s BC was sort of a new culture, a blend of Greek and local influence. Still, the Greeks left their stamp on the ancient world very strongly. And Western civilization, to say nothing of other civilizations, would never be the same.